Welcome to rePROs Fight Back, a podcast on all things related to sexual and reproductive health rights and justice. Hi, rePROs. How's everybody doing? I'm your host, Jenny Wetter, and my pronouns are she, her. So y'all, can you believe this week marks 7 years of this podcast? I cannot believe that I have been hosting this podcast for that long. Honestly, if you had asked me when we had our launch party 7 years ago, if I would still be doing this, I would have not believed that 7 years later we would still be going strong. I am feeling so lucky to have, such a wonderful audience. Thank you all. I feel lucky to have such amazing conversations with so many wonderful guests. Like, I've talked to so many amazing people over the 7 years of the podcast that it all feels kind of unreal. I am so grateful for the amazing team that we have at rePROs, Rachel and Elena. They do amazing work for the podcast, which is generally behind the scenes, so you don't see it, but Rachel is in charge of making sure that you get wonderful show notes and keeping the website up to date, and she does so much other stuff. Most importantly, this week, Rachel released an amazing new brief that she wrote on the Helms Amendment and its harms, so definitely check that out. I'll make sure that Rachel includes a link to her brief in the show notes because, y'all, you should read it. It is a wonderful product, and I'm just, congratulations, Rachel. You did a great job. And Elena, who does our social media, they just do an outstanding job with our social media presence. I'm so grateful for all of the work that both of them do. They really keep the rePROs initiative going strong, making sure that the podcast gets out there. Oh, Elena also does the transcripts to make sure that y'all can enjoy the podcast in whatever form you would like. So we would not be what we are now without Rachel and Elena. And also just super grateful to Meg, who does our editing so that I sound like I know what I'm talking about and sound my best. So thank you, Meg. I appreciate all of the work that you have done helping launch and doing editing for the podcast for 7 years. I mean, and Rachel has been with me for the entire 7 years too. So this is amazing. I'm just so grateful to the Population Institute for all of their support, and Kathleen for her support as our executive director for the podcast, and especially to my old boss, Bob, who pushed me into doing the podcast. I could not imagine that it would be just the absolute favorite part of my job when he had asked me to do it, and I very firmly was not interested. So just really thankful that he pushed me to get me to do it, because I've had such a wonderful time having so many amazing conversations with such wonderful guests. And if you have been with me for 7 years, or if today is your first episode, thank you so much. I am so grateful to each and every one of you. And if you enjoy the podcast, I hope you will share it with your friends, rate and review us on whatever platform you are listening to it on or enjoying it on. Thank you. If you want to support our podcast more, you can make a donation to rePROs Fight Back. We still have wonderful fun giveaways for donations. So if you donate $25, you get these amazing stickers designed by Liberal Jane that talk about, we have ones that say support rePRO podcasts with my cats on them. We have reproductive rights are human rights. We have / the patriarchy ones. We have fund abortion, fight evil. They're all very fun, and you should definitely donate to get some. Also, if you want to donate at $50, we have amazing bags that you will get in addition to the stickers that are really fun. They're have a comic book speech bubble on them and say abortion is a human right, not a dirty word, and our bright hot pink and purple logo colors. So very fun. If you want to support us, for $25 you get the stickers, for $50 you get the stickers in the bag. So I hope you can support us. Let's see. Oh, the next thing. I feel like there's so much housekeeping in this episode. Sorry about that, but really important. We are going to take the next 2 weeks off. rePROs comes out on Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve this year, so we just decided that we would take it off, and we will see you all next year. It's a really good chance for us to just step away and take some time off and just relax and get all prepared for everything we are going to be dealing with next year. So we will be gone for the next 2 weeks, but we will see everybody next year. Okay, y'all, that was so much, and I think we'll just go to this week's episode. Sorry that the up top was basically all housekeeping, but I'm very excited for this week's episode. We are talking to Rori Kramer at the American Jewish World Service about human rights. It seemed like, we talk about human rights a lot on the podcast and how the issues we care about and work on are human rights. But maybe it was time to take a step back and just talk about what are human rights and to talk about the ways they are going to be under attack during the next administration. So with that, let's turn to my interview with Rori. Hi, Rori. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks so much, Jenny. So excited to be here with you.
I'm very excited to talk to you today. One, because you're amazing. But two, we're going to talk about human rights, which is something we talk about a lot on the podcast, in that repro rights are human rights, trans rights are human rights, but we don't necessarily get down to the nitty gritty of what do we mean when we talk about human rights. But the really important thing is, before I do that, maybe we should have you introduce yourself. Sometimes I get so excited to have the conversation, I start before I do the important part. Would you like to introduce yourself and include your pronouns?
Absolutely. I'm Rori Kramer. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm the director of U.S. Advocacy at American Jewish World Service.
Okay. Now that we got the work part out of the way, let's have the conversation. I'm really excited, like I said, to talk about human rights. Do you maybe want to tell us a little bit of big picture, what are we talking about when we say human rights?
Absolutely. So, human rights are born out of the belief that every individual is equal and deserving of life, dignity, respect, freedom. And then human rights takes those beliefs and identifies what is needed for human flourishing and places those obligations on states to deliver them. Whatever those rights are, right to life, right to political participation, right to a fair trial. And, I think for those of us that work in these areas, whether they be sectoral or broader human rights, we all know, but worth repeating, that these were all codified after World War II by the international community. And in fact, good timing, Jenny, that this is actually the 76th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights being ratified and adopted at the UN. And it's also kind of sad, since this is a time when they are more under a threat than ever, really. And another kind of sad part about it is that the U.S. was an early champion of these values, right? A leader among all the nations in getting them adopted and in deploying the resources to communities around the world facing poverty and persecution. And I think something to keep in mind before we get even more into the nitty-gritty is that when these rights were established, they were enumerated applying to all human beings equally, regardless of origin, status, race, religion, nationality, gender. And they were also really focused on being indivisible. The Declaration pointedly declined to elevate certain rights above others because the authors were too aware of that this opened the path to selective interpretations of these principles. And, some of the most fundamental texts that the international community relies on since then have elaborated on this theme. So in the United Nations 1993 Vienna Declaration, it stated explicitly that all human rights were universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. And I think it's so important to keep the interrelated part in mind, not only because obviously the forces that are looking to take away our basic human rights are always trying to segment us out, but really because of the way the work that AJWS does is so interrelated. And I think so much of the partners that we work with. So if I could take a moment now to take a step back and talk about the work we do to sort of set up so I can really express how impressive the work our partners are and how it helps really educate us here in the United States. So we're a grant-making and advocacy organization that is dedicated to champion human rights around the world. Wonderful, laudable goal that I am sure a lot of other organizations hold. But we do this in a really sort of unique way. So we fund more than 500 social change and human rights organizations in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean in the areas of sexual health and rights, civil and political rights, land, water, climate, justice, and then on certain occasions, disaster humanitarian relief. And we do this by also accompanying those grantees with our local staff who share the knowledge and the social movements on the ground and bringing those grantees together and embolden those movements. And then finally, where I come into the picture is that we advocate in Washington and sometimes internationally to shift those laws and policies to promote human rights work and strengthen those grassroots efforts in their countries because of the outsized role the United States plays. And that really is predicating all of our U.S. work, right? That no matter what, the U.S. is really holding outsized role, whether for good or for bad, to make the enabling environment for our partners even easier. So, we are now in a position where I think for the first time, the United States citizens can kind of see the work that our partners are doing. So to get back to their work, in the countries where we work, the criminalization of human rights is never an issue area, criminalization, that we think of it in DC. Authoritarian governments seek to criminalize the exercise of democracy, the defense of rule of law or civic space. And they don't specify often on particular rights of the people they're fighting for. Sometimes there's obviously individual hideous laws, right? Like what's going on in Uganda now with the Anti-Homosexuality Act. But ultimately, it is a constriction of that civic space and of the exercise of people's basic dignity and human rights. And so the challenging of the government abuse to violate those rights is really what those governments perceive as the threat, regardless of the rights that they're fighting for. So we see so often across our issue areas and across our geographic coverage that those movements are working together to defend those rights. So, for example, in a country like Nicaragua, demanding sexual and reproductive health and rights of the communities they support. And the communities are equally affected by their violations of the civil and political rights because the entire country is living under a dictatorial system that denies its citizens its rights. Similarly, in El Salvador, where abortion is entirely illegal, including therapeutic abortion, feminist groups are threatened and harassed by the state because that is how the authoritarians respond to the challenging of their power. So not to pivot too much to the United States right off the bat, but we're already starting to see that these authoritarians are feeling emboldened by the election of Trump. And then in turn, some of the Republican efforts in Congress already that are seeking to shrink civic space to mirror some of the efforts of some of these authoritarian governments already. I think I've been saying since the election, hugging dictators anywhere is good for dictators everywhere. So it's this vicious circle and loop of the more we're emboldening any dictators, all dictators everywhere are like coming to the party and excited to be able to sort of share best practices.
Well, that obviously leads me to think about like some of the things that happened in the first Trump administration where there was like not just actions they took that impacted people's human rights, but like an actual attack on the human rights framework itself, with things like the Unalienable Rights Commission and the Geneva Consensus Declaration, which trademark Rachel Moynihan was neither in Geneva nor was it a consensus document.
Discuss amongst yourselves.
Yeah, exactly. So are we thinking we're going to face some of these same like actual attacks on the way human rights are talked about, like versus like just versus like direct attacks on the exercise of rights? Does that make sense?
Why choose, Jenny? Why choose?
I mean, both are going to happen. Maybe let's start with the like big picture then.
I think for your listeners that are familiar with both the Geneva Consensus and the Commission on Unalienable Rights, I'd say first off, sorry.
Yeah.
And second off, I think those are just the starting points, right? They're going to pick these things up and start from there. I actually was a bit more familiar with the Commission on Unalienable Rights. Sadly for me, I attended every public meeting.
Sorry.
It was unpleasant personally, but also, from a human rights perspective, it was a mockery of human rights, having, I believe at the time, no members that had actually been part and parcel the practice of human rights. And, certainly a mockery of government commissions that purport to actually care about advancing policy. And what it also did pretty clearly and was really reactionary, specifically on an abuse of religious freedom, right? Trump's folks did and certainly will continue in this administration to sort of confuse the freedom to worship, which is a human right, and grossly confuse it with the state license to advance their own particular brand of religious expression. And we saw this really, really clearly with the commission, where they came out with that the most important, at the top of the pinnacle, are property rights, which when you talk about property rights and America's founding documents, there's also a lot of like creepy racism tied in there, but also religious freedom. But they didn't mean religious freedom for you and me, Jenny. And they certainly didn't mean religious freedom for anyone besides their very specific sort of white Christian nationalism form, which is, frankly, un-American, even though that was certainly what the founders had at the time. But when you look at the advancement of the United States and of our founding documents, they have progressed to be in the 21st century. And that is absolutely not. And to be honest, if we're going to evoke founding fathers, and I know that he's not immune from critique, but Thomas Jefferson actually went out of his way at the time to make sure there was no state established religion. That's actually one of the things he was most proud of. So it was really laughable when Mike Pompeo and his goons were like, oh, no, we're going to ignore that part, but we're going to embrace the slavery part. Sorry, that was a little bit of editorial there.
I mean, again, it goes back to what you were talking about at the beginning, which is these rights are indivisible. You can't, there's not a hierarchy like that the U.S. was trying to create then.
Absolutely. And, certainly it's very difficult to look at something that is about the Unalienable Commission on Human Rights and then also not talk about anything that's happened in the 20th or 21st century around human rights. Was laughable. Not to steal any of Rachel Moynihan's thunder, but I also think that this was not a commission because it believed that they were in violation of several U.S. regulations around commissions. It was not really grounded in human rights. And I do believe that the Declaration of Independence talked about an inalienable right, not an unalienable right. So that always really annoyed me as well. But, that's neither here.
Oh, talk about me typing it all the time, and I always was trying to do it the wrong way.
So, that's just I think we should just rename it as another, no thanks, Mike Pompeo. I just think that a lot of your listeners are also probably very familiar with what a lot of the actors that were behind both of these things have been doing the last 4 years. And it's not been doing other productive things. It's been trying to advance these two really faulty and offensive regimes abroad where they could, in countries that also do not really have democracy or are authoritarian curious, and moving forward with it there. And our partners have actually seen some very U.S. fingerprints, let's just put it that way, on a lot of the work they were doing in trying to protect their own human rights, whether they be SHR or otherwise, in their own countries. And so it's very, very disheartening to know not only has that work been continuing unabated abroad, but now the U.S. bully pulpit, which obviously just is not perfect and comes with lots of strings attached, but there has been in the past a U.S. bully pulpit where they have the U.S. government speaking out on behalf of those marginalized communities, even if the actions have not been there, but at least speaking out. And now the bully pulpit will be used fully to take away their rights. So I think that we'll see attacks formulated and grounded in religious freedom, which are obviously to take away other people's human rights. As you can imagine, many of our supporters, American Jews around the country and clergy, are grossly offended by this and want to mobilize on this. They wanted to mobilize on it 4 years ago, and I can't imagine that they're going to feel that this speaks on behalf of them. And I imagine millions of other Americans will feel like this does not speak on behalf of them.
Yeah, thinking of the work that has been done in the last 4 years and I'm sure polishing their work, bringing other countries on board or working to get them to come on board when the documents open up again or coming into practice again, worried to see those people coming back.
Mm-hmm. And they all have great jobs ahead of them, real fancy jobs. And I think that, as you brought up, individual efforts legislatively or big picture or internationally or regulatory in the executive branch, I think we see all of those. And not only because they have the ability to, but because that's part of the plan, is to overwhelm, to everything be whack-a-mole. And it is tiring. I think we've already seen with some bills that were on the floor almost as test cases in the last few months, but we will absolutely see in Congress moving forward are these bills around the closing of civic space. So that is, anti-terrorism, pro-transparency, all the things that are good and wonderful and we all support, but the proof is in the pudding, or the devil's in the details or whatever euphemism you want to use are absolutely going to be true here, because there is no benefit for anybody, whether it's abroad or at home, with having a closed civic space with the control of an authoritarian government. The fewer civil society organizations there are anywhere is bad. And using a government arm around taxes or around funding as the stick with very little carrot is not diplomacy. It is just authoritarian curious. And I think a lot of Trump's allies have seen this work abroad. Our partners certainly have seen this work against them abroad. And so we're very concerned about those pieces of legislation. And in particular, around transparency pieces, the government already has names and addresses of people that are subcontractees. But to make those things public for public transparency, I'm using air quotes here, it could actually be a kill list for partners that we have, partners around the world, where their names and their addresses would be incredibly personally dangerous to them because they are criminalized in the activities they do in their countries. I think for this, you see certainly that SRHR groups at home and abroad, but certainly now more at home than we've ever seen before, are going to be the canary in the coal mine. But as I mentioned earlier, they are in partnership and should be in partnership with democracy activists everywhere. So as soon as you see one of these groups start to be attacked, we should all take heart that everybody's human rights are about to be abused. And, I think that sticking, I guess, still to the legislative and congressional piece of this, because that sometimes is a little bit more public than the regulatory things that they're going to do in the executive branch, is that, bipartisanship, I hate saying this, but bipartisanship for the most part could be a mirage. We don't want the result of this election to be, okay, well, we should do more work with Trump because that's what the American people wanted, without a careful eye that, just something being bipartisan is not a good in and of itself. This is absolutely not your father's Republican Party. There are not a lot of efforts that I have seen, and I have worked in Washington for a quarter of a century, which sounds like a lot saying it that way, in and out of government, on the Hill, in the executive branch, certainly in the nonprofit and advocacy community. And this is not where we were 25 years ago. This is not where we were 15 years ago. And there are not a lot of good faith effort actors who want to do something that is bipartisan for its sake. So I am imploring so many of our allies on the Hill to look at something with a very keen and watchful eye and not do something just because it is bipartisan. And I think these Trojan horse transparency and anti-terrorism bills are a great example. Like, there are times that you're just not going to be able to do a bipartisan thing on this because the thing itself that they are asking you to do is undemocratic. And I mean that in the lowercase d democratic. It does not comport with the rule of law, and it does not comport with an American tradition of democracy. And I think it's really important for all of us, both in and out of government, and that it also includes just regular citizens, to remember that there are really no guardrails. Like, guardrails are people. It is just people. And this is really, really important for you to remember, that you need to bring a clear eye and vigilance to sort of all of your reasoning behind, whether it's legislation, policy determinations, personnel decisions that the administration is going to be making, that we are the ones that are here to protect us. There is nothing else.
I think this is such an important conversation. And I think maybe we want to take like a quick little second that we're familiar with, but maybe the audience isn't super familiar with, and talk just a little bit about the anti-terrorism bill piece. Because while it's something that we have been talking about and concerned about, I think it hasn't necessarily broken out in the same way. And just do like a really quick, like 3,000 foot level of like, what was in this bill that we were so worried about?
Absolutely. Can I take an extra step back just to make a big picture around?
Of course.
This was a tax bill, which, as somebody who spent my career in U.S. foreign policy and also, human rights, I was like, tax, what? I think that it's important to remember that it's the same issues, and they're just going to find a lot of different buckets to put them in. And so that's why I feel like a lot of
needing to have eyes everywhere.
I am lucky. One of my good friends is a tax policy expert in Washington, but like, gosh, if this moves to like labor standard. I don't know any labor people. So like we're all so segmented in Washington, it can be dangerous. But so, I think a lot of us, and probably a lot of your former guests, have been calling these bills Trojan horse bills, which I actually think is not even fair because my kids love the Iliad and the Odyssey. And obviously the Trojans are the good guys anyway, but whatever. It even makes me sad for that. And it's because these are things that on their face seem fine. And so this bill in particular that I was referring to is a bill that would revoke the tax exempt status of any organization in the U.S. that uses its money to support terrorism. Who is against that? No one is against that. Everyone supports that. But first of all, and probably most important, that's already illegal. So what kind of problem are we solving for? Are we solving for an actual problem? Jenny, no, we are not solving for an actual problem. We are solving for an authoritarian curious problem, which is to close civic space. Because in the current status, to become a terrorist group and a terrorist supporting group, there has to be actual evidence in the rule of law and a very deliberative and slow bureaucratic process, right? So the process that everyone bemoans, bureaucracy, is actually here a protection and part of the rule of law. So not only does it exist, but there's already a process that people can go back and look at, and it's public. This bill would purport to do it all with secret evidence and evidence that the Secretary of Treasury that would control a lot of this wouldn't necessarily need to share. So regardless of who the president is and who the Secretary of Treasury is, it's a dangerous precedent and one that our partners have seen in their countries. And I should restate that we only operate in countries, and by we I say AGWS, only operates in countries that have a problem with democracy or already authoritarian government. So if we've seen this model already, it's not a good sign for America. So this bill was put on the floor and it didn't pass. And so they brought it back with a lower threshold of votes. And the good news was actually that the more people learned about this bill, the more they were like, oh, wait, this is a problem. But it had actually gotten quite a lot of bipartisan support earlier in the Congress because people, listen, I'm a former health staffer, so I have a lot of sympathy and empathy for their lives. You don't often have a time to read everything. You will look at the Congressional Research Service top line or a really quick summary page, and then you give your boss a recommendation of what to vote. So when things are packaged as, oh, this is important to fight terrorism, and this would revoke status for people who are supporting terrorists, of course that sounds great. So this is absolutely, as you say, Jenny, a clarion call that, the civic societies, organizations and nonprofits need to be really active to make sure that everybody on the Hill, before they have votes like this, understand what they're actually voting on and flag for people ahead of time. Because not only are we going to have to educate foreign policy staffers on tax bills or anything like that, but it's also sometimes things get introduced and then they lay fallow for a while. And then they are shoved in to become amendments. And again, that's the way that stuff gets made. I actually have helped former bosses of mine pass really important, good work in a conference procedure, after it wasn't an amendment that was approved on the floor or really complicated procedural things that most members and their staff aren't tracking because there's so many things going on at once. So it is really incumbent on us, not only as people who work in the sector, but as citizens who follow these issues, to be flagging these things when we see them. So it's going to be, again, anti-terrorism tax bills. It's going to be transparency for people who receive U.S. aid, which, again, is laudable and important, but not if it actually puts their personal lives at risk. So this is definitely a reminder for everybody listening that, even if you don't think this is something you work on now, this is something you work on now. And, we found that a lot of our supporters who first and foremost are supporting us because they know that we do important work and get funds to grassrooted human rights organizations in, X country. They responded really, really quickly when they heard about this bill and, this is using this bill as an example because they understood the impact that it would have for people like our partners, but also the impact it would have on us as Americans. A lot of things are changing. And I know that is really, really hard for Americans to understand because I, too, am an American who it is hard to understand that, we don't live anymore in the America of 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. We are living in a different kind of America that will require all citizens to be more engaged because, again, there are no guardrails. They're just people. It's like the people are the only thing standing between us and whatever on the other side of it is.
Are there any other ways that you are keeping an eye out on what we are expecting around human rights and ways that we're going to see human rights attacked under this new administration or returning administration?
The once and future. So, I think we're watching a lot of also nominations processes, but, which is even scarier than the nominations process or the political appointments that don't require Senate confirmation, right? Those people get to just come in. And, even though you can say, Marco Rubio is a normie Republican who has experience in foreign policy and actually can find the countries on a map. Absolutely, 100% he can, and 100% he's a normie Republican. But hundreds of people that will be brought in to work for him are not. And, that is absolutely something that we are watching. They are people who have been vetted through the Project 2025 project, through their loyalty and ideology, and they are MAGA loyalists. They are probably MAGA loyalists before they're American loyalists, and that's a concern. When I went to work at the State Department, I had to pledge a loyalty oath to the Constitution. And so if these folks come in and they also have to pledge a loyalty oath to the president, that is A, really bad, and B, I think tells you a lot of where their priorities are going to be. So that is something we're going to be watching. I know that for the average American, it's hard to follow policies that are going to be promulgated out of agencies by a lot of these political appointees that don't have Senate confirmation. So in that respect, I'd say also it's really important that the civic society organizations you support are robustly supported to do that, where we can work together with each other, which is another thing that I think is going to be a really wonderful silver lining. I'm throwing my hands up and trying to find the word, right? Things are going to be bad, but we are really all going to work together in a way I think that even we didn't 8 years ago, because this isn't hashtag resistance time. It's I'm not even going to say a hashtag because I don't say that usually, but it is really going to be confronting attempts at authoritarian efforts at government, right? So this isn't Trump's a fascist, because that doesn't mean anything to most Americans. And, it doesn't mean anything probably anyway, because people define these things differently. But you cannot dispute that the actions he has already taken and already says he wants to take, and Project 2025 says he's going to take, and the people who work for him are going to take, are authoritarian in nature, which means collecting power together and getting rid of dissenting voices and concentrating of power in one part of government, right? And America has always really prided itself on having a separation of powers. And so we're already seeing that minimize itself. And so I do think that civil society, and that does include me, certainly, but hundreds of organizations and thousands of people who are going to come together to confront whether they're regulations with regular old-fashioned advocacy in Washington, whether it means lawsuits that they can join to go against things, whether it means really getting regular citizens excited and engaged to advocate to their congresspeople on things. It's going to be across the whole board, and it is a marathon, not a sprint. And so I think that we really have to keep our eye on the different pieces of it and probably divide and conquer. There's no way that we're all going to be able to do all the things.
Yeah, this is something I have been really trying to, one, internalize, and two, make sure to keep in mind as I'm thinking about what we're going to do next year and making sure to talk about on the podcast, is that you can't do all the things. You just can't. You have to take care of yourself. A lot of this authoritarian rule is to try and overwhelm you so you feel like you can't do anything and make you give up. So with all of that in mind, what can the audience do? How can they get involved in these efforts?
Yeah. I'm going to start again talking about our partners, because they are so impressive. And to be honest, I'm starting to feel more and more in a similar position to them, right? In a place that Americans never thought that they would be. So what they do whenever they're campaigning and doing something and they fail, they sort of gather, reassess, and begin again. And, I think not giving up and not becoming complacent is something that is really hard to do. So I think first and foremost, we need to keep that in mind. I know that a lot of people are talking about this in different contexts, but I think another thing that is very important is not to ever accept it as normal and not to comply in advance. And I'm saying this as someone who, just like even in the news the last few days, you're just seeing so many people comply in advance in a way that is deeply unnecessary and deeply unhelpful. So I think those are two like really important signposts or milestones or to keep in mind. And then another thing that is frustrating and we have to develop is that foreign policy in general doesn't really have a built-in constituency in the United States. And, governments love that, I think, right? Because they don't have to worry about that piece as much. And so when you actually reach out to government people, even at the local level, right? Obviously local level folks don't have control over it, but like your local congressperson's office, it is incredibly powerful for them to hear from you because they're not used to hearing from constituents about global human rights, about any foreign policy, but certainly global human rights. And we have found that like it is incredibly powerful, even in smaller numbers, to reach out on that. But going back to the local part, I think also, and Jenny, I know you share this very strongly as well, is that like there's not as much of a divide anymore, right? The global assault on trans folks we're seeing here at home. The global assault on abortion rights is already being seen at home. The global assault on basic civil and political rights is now being seen at home. So I think if we start to think of ourselves as part of like the global to local, which I know used to be like a positive thing and now is obviously like a kind of a negative thing, is we should be expressing that at home too. And so like fighting for these rights in your local community is not unrelated to fighting for those rights that our partners do in Senegal, right? So I think that just not staying quiet and being ready to act when you can at any level of government that you feel like you can is going to be important. Now, AWS has some specific plans that we want to be doing and we want to be in spaces, but I also think that we're understanding that a lot of the traditional forms of government advocacy that we have used forever and that like I have used and no matter what job I've had are not, it's going to be a much narrower path to that. So I think that also folks that work in U.S. advocacy are going to need to do some more outside of government advocacy, whether it's with other actors or also just like narrative change and really holding the media to account as well.
Yeah. And this really makes me think, so often, maybe it's just because I work in this field, like abortion comes up often in conversations with people, when your friends are talking about whatever the new attack on abortion or accessing abortion is, like you can have just like a simple conversation and talk about how it's not only here, the U.S. is also exporting these policies and talk about why they need to care about the U.S. exporting human rights violations, right? Like preventing people from accessing care and like why they should also care about the global stakes in this conversation.
100%.
Okay, Rori, thank you so much for being here. It was wonderful to talk to you all about human rights today. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks so much for having me. And I'm glad it's a good reminder to everyone that we should all be talking about human rights all the time.
Exactly.
Thanks so much, Jenny.
Okay, y'all, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Rori. It was so great to get to talk to her all about human rights. And just a reminder, we're not going to be around for the next 2 weeks, so I will see y'all in the new year. If you have any questions, comments, or topics you would like us to cover, always feel free to shoot me an email. You can reach me at Jenny, Jennie, at rePROsFightBack.com, or you can find us on social media. We're at rePROs Fight Back on Facebook and Twitter, or rePROs FB on Instagram. If you love our podcast and want to make sure more people find it, take the time to rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Or if you want to make sure to support the podcast, you can also donate on our website at rePROsFightBack.com. Thanks all.